Hello, Dr. Carb here, and welcome to my channel where we are focused on you becoming your own authority in health. And today we're going to be mind mapping a study that came across my desk. Mind mapping, of course, is a way for you to visually represent some information so that it sticks in your head and you're able to put things in their context and how they're related. And just from the first part of this mind map, you can see that most studies are divided up into the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Generally, the author makes the case for why this is important, talking about the impact of diet and mortality and various diseases. Then they go into what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. Then they discuss their results without commentary, if it's a good study. They just report their results, and then in the discussion they talk about what the impact of those results are, and they're supposed to, in a good article, talk about the limitations and suggestions for future studies as well. So let's jump into the meaning of the name, which is a mouthful. Lower carbohydrate diets, of course you understand that, and all-cause mortality, meaning death from any cause. And in this case, they're going to be looking at specifically from cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, meaning mostly death from strokes, and cancer as well. And then they talk about it as a population-based cohort study. That's the first part, meaning they're looking at a large group of people, and we'll go through who those people are, and which means they are then using other data, pooling of prospective studies, meaning they're taking a bunch of other studies and combining it or drawing conclusions from those studies as well in the context of what they can find out about lower carbohydrate diets and how people are dying. So let's talk about the aims of the article based upon the authors. Most of what I'm going to be discussing here is really, we want to look at it from the author's perspective. I will be making comments about that as we go. My main comment really for this whole video is really that when you look at these studies, you really have to look at them as a population-based study, meaning the authors, although they may not specifically say, they are really looking for information and trying to determine what would be the best recommendations for people on a global scale. And that information is important. There's no question about it that that information is important. But we also have to realize that when we're dealing with the new generation of personalized medicine, sometimes we can't personalize generalized information. I mean, we can't take population-based data and make it fit the individual because each person is unique. It's like when they say to someone that they have a certain percent chance of X happening. Well, you are not a number, so you can't follow those numbers necessarily. They provide valuable information that you can use to guide your decisions. But again, in the era of personalized medicine, anything goes in the sense that you really need to become your own authority about your own situation and still follow all of these studies because they are valuable, they are important, and that's how science progresses one study at a time. So let's jump right into it, and you'll get a little bit of a better understanding of my perspective. But I think the most important part of this video is for us to look at what they think. What are the authors of this study really thinking about? So they discuss it as, what are the aims of their article? Their aims of their article is to determine lower carbohydrate and overall and cause-specific mortality using individual data and pooled prospective studies. And that's basically just a restatement of what they just spoke about here. So what is a prospective cohort study? And that's a research study that follows over time groups of individuals who are alike in many ways but differ by a certain characteristic. For example, female nurses who smoke and those who do not smoke, and compares them for a particular outcome, such as lung cancer. So in this case, they're looking at lower carbohydrate diets in a specific group, and they're looking at a specific outcome, meaning, and we know what those outcomes are, they are all-cause mortality, and also can they look at it from a cause-specific mortality, meaning a can they look at it from heart disease perspective, from a cerebrovascular disease, that is stroke, or cancer. Okay, let's close that down and go to the introduction. And again, I am summarizing the article's introduction. They talk about overall the impact of obesity and why this is such an important thing. They are contextualizing their study and why their study is so important. Because we know that obesity is associated with increased cardiovascular disease, hypertension or high blood pressure, and type 2 diabetes. And cardiovascular disease being the main global cause of death, greater than 17.3 million, and I add premature deaths annually. Leading cause of death in the U.S. in 2015, accounting for 864,000, and I add premature deaths. Think about it from a personal perspective. The amount of grief and sadness of people who shouldn't have died at the time they did because of cardiovascular disease. And the authors want to get to the bottom of that on a population-based level for general suggestions to the population. Should they recommend lower carbohydrate diets or shouldn't they? And that's what they're trying to determine. So let's talk about lower carbohydrate diets from their perspective. And according to their perspective, they don't really think that there's a lot of long-term data on LCD or lower carbohydrate diet safety. They cite 2 European high-protein groups, which showed higher overall and cause-specific mortality. And we are seeing that high animal protein, no question about it, has been associated with decreased longevity and increased cancer. Other studies have shown higher rates, and others actually have shown lower rates of mortality, most notably in Japan. And they mention that randomized studies are not really easily feasible, meaning it would be difficult to create a study where you put 1,000 people in a low carbohydrate group and another in a high carbohydrate group, and then follow them out, because obviously there are nuances to lower carbohydrate diets. You can have high protein, you can have high fat, and these particular distinctions in lower carbohydrate diets are minimally looked at in the study. That would be one of the negatives of this study. They do correctly mention a few times in the study this high protein issue, which is important because it's easier from a scientific perspective to understand why high animal protein leads to higher overall and cause-specific mortality, which I've mentioned in other videos. But they didn't go into a huge amount of detail, breaking it down between high fat versus high protein. And they say, we aim to contextualize these results by performing a review and a meta-analysis, meaning they're going to be looking at other studies as well, to examine associations between lower carbohydrate diets and all-cause and cause-specific mortality by using findings from prospective cohort studies, which you now know what that means. And they basically say they're contextualizing these results. So meaning they want to have a context for making recommendations overall based upon the data that they have. That was their introduction. Let's go to their methods. They use the NHANES cohort study, prospective cohort study, and this is, you're going to see this all over the place because this information has been incredibly valuable. It's the U.S. National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's based on a 2-year, in this case, in the data they used is based on 2-year survey cycles between 1999 and 2010, people aged greater than 20. This is a huge repository of information that can be used by researchers to determine all kinds of different things. Of course, it's based on 24-hour, in this case, based on 24-hour food recall by a trained interviewer hoping to minimize the problems associated with people trying to remember what they ate. Of course, that's always a limitation in these things, but it doesn't negate or get rid of the value of NHANES, and you'll see this. You'll see this, the importance of this, if we if we do other studies in the mind map format. And if you like this format, please do make a comment below or put a study that you would like me to mind map for you. The mortality measurements they used: all-cause mortality, meaning death from any cause, mortality due to heart disease, mortality due to cancer, mortality due to cerebrovascular disease or strokes, generally. And they created a score, meaning they needed to figure out essentially how are they going to measure whether someone's carbohydrate, lower carbohydrate, what is a carbohydrate diet. And they came up with a score. The highest possible score would be 30, which would indicate the highest fat and protein and the lowest carbohydrate. And the way they did this is they would rank the person's carbohydrate intake at 10 points if it was really low and 0 at the highest, and then the opposite with protein and fat. So a 0 would be they're not eating any lowest intake, and 10 would be the highest intake. So the highest possible score of 30 would indicate highest fat, protein, and the lowest carbohydrates. One could make many comments on this because it doesn't really give you a good understanding again of the protein fat ratio necessarily, and 2, it doesn't really say how many grams of carbohydrate that's going to be. We'll talk about that in their results, and you'll see that what came out as low carbohydrate doesn't actually feel all that low. Which also makes the personal recommendations for yourself a little bit more nuanced. Let's go into the results. The participant data is divided up into that first group, which we spoke about, the NHANES data, and then the meta-analysis, which is a review of those other studies, the pooling of prospective studies in the title. The participant data: 24,000 people, a mean age of 47, roughly half men, half women, and various demographic and age differences when they divided the scores, from 0 to 30 into fourths. And that's how they looked at the information. They took the scores and they divided them in fourths, and they looked at the differences. And they looked at mortality data, death data over 144 months. And just for context, there were 3,400 deaths and 827 cancer, 709, 228 cerebrovascular deaths, premature, all of them. And again, enormous costs emotionally for families. Highest score. Here are the list of the results. Essentially, to summarize, they found, according to their data, pretty much highest score, meaning highest amount of protein and fat and lowest carbohydrate, had the highest risk of mortality. Again, keep in mind we're in the results section, which means we're not drawing conclusions yet. They're just reporting their data here. Positive association between cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular mortality across increased quartiles of the lower carbohydrate diet score based upon the score. So as the score increased, there was a positive association between these. Positive association between the LCD and risk of cancer mortality, and also positive association between lower carbohydrate, high protein diets and overall and cause-specific mortality. And they made comment a few times now about this association between high protein and overall and cause-specific mortality. We'll see in the results section that even though they do single out in a few sentences the high protein issue, they don't necessarily make any kind of suggestion that there could be some confounding information. What if someone's on a high fat diet specifically? They don't seem to have data on that, and one could conjecture that we don't know the impact of a lower carbohydrate, high fat diet. and overall and cause-specific mortality. And I believe that the authors here made comments specifically about high protein, specifically because they don't really have the data and didn't make any real conjecture or guesses based upon what could potentially be something different in regards to lower carbohydrate, high fat diets. They also mentioned that mortality was stronger in non-obese with a BMI of less than 30 and older, greater than 55 years. Now, let's move over to the meta-analysis, which, as I discussed, is this and pooling of prospective studies. The meta-analysis, meaning they took a whole bunch of studies, 9 studies, 462,000 participants, 45,000 mortality events, 45,000 deaths. And they found similar results, positive association between LCD and overall mortality, cardiovascular mortality, cancer mortality, and again, they made a mention of the isolated high protein issue. Not making any comment on high fat issue. Let's go into the discussion now. They just reported the results and now they jump into the discussion. So they say we might try to answer the question on the definition of lower carbohydrate diets that might increase the long-term mortality risk. And in this case, they mention 214 grams of carbohydrate per day, as well as definition of long-term lower carbohydrate diets based on survival curves for overall mortality. So they might try to answer the question, and they based this on 214, that the median LCD score, meaning the median lower carbohydrate assessment, was 214 grams per day, which if you're on a lower carbohydrate diet, that's not lower carbohydrate by any stretch. So I'll leave that there. We accept that other definitions of lower carbohydrate diets require that the intakes are less than 20% or less than 150 grams per day. So they're aware that there are people who are doing that. But even so, they say, we believe our results are of value to the wider question of diet patterns and long-term risks, especially as few can sustain such low-carb intakes over long periods of time. This sentence is important because it basically explains that although they are aware of what a lower carbohydrate diet is in other contexts, and they don't mention ketogenic diets or other lower carbohydrate diets, they are evidently well aware of what they are, but they refuse to mention what they are. That they say exactly what I mentioned earlier, which is that we are talking, and they wish to narrow it down to the wider question, population-wide, the wider question of diet patterns and long-term risks, especially the wider question of diet patterns and long-term risks. They're making population-based recommendations, which again do not necessarily pertain to you as an individual, regardless of how valuable this information is. I'm not telling you to disregard this because you are some expert in diets and know what's best for yourself. You need to study that on your own and work with the experts that you know to determine that. But to realize that most of these studies, and this one is being very clear about it, are talking about population-based information, which is incredibly valuable. And they say our results are somewhat in accordance with other studies. The Swedish study, which they mentioned, this is the one that was high protein, which we spoke about, has been getting more information about the impact that high protein is especially high animal protein is a problem in people's diets. Talking about the EPIC study, another study that you will be seeing popping up from now and then, the European Prospective Investigation Cancer and Nutrition Study, EPIC, also showed high protein was associated with cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality. And they're trying to say that they're showing other studies, but it's interesting that they isolated the two ones that showed high animal protein associated with negatives. But they also showed that the opposite was found in a Japanese study that showed that there was a benefit to a lower carbohydrate diet in the Japanese group. And they conjectured that it was based on the fact that they already eat a higher amount of carbohydrates to begin with, obviously in the form of rice and noodles. So what could be the reason? Well, they say reduced fiber and fruits and increased animal protein, cholesterol, and saturated fat, increased cancer with intake of animal protein, high intake of protein of animal sources may essentially increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. Vegetables, fruits, cereals, and legumes, core components of healthy dietary patterns. I'll mention again, in this case, it is true that when you look at it population-wide, that it does seem that when you increase overall this on a population-based way, you do generally see decreases. That doesn't necessarily mean that things like cereals and beans are good for everybody, or fruits are good for everybody. For the most part, vegetables are good for everybody. And for most people who are not suffering from various conditions, which I'm not going to go into now, but certainly on, again, a population-based, when people are eating unprocessed plant-based foods, generally they're healthier than other groups. They spoke about refined versus non-refined. They spoke about the Nurses' Health Study. Both of these are studies that you're going to see popping up from now and then. That higher whole grain consumption was 9% lower total mortality and 50% lower cardiovascular disease. In another study, I'll discuss the impact of what does 9% actually mean and 50% actually mean, so that you can understand statistics a little bit better. But regardless, these are statistically relevant decreases, again, on a wide population-based study. And then the Pure study, another one that actually I haven't seen it pop up all that much, but prospective urban-rural epidemiology, and it is what you think, which is basically looking at an urban population where 70% of carbs are simple carbohydrates, and as would be expected, there was a higher mortality with, in this case, with increased carbohydrates, most likely related to higher simple sugar intake. Now they go into the limitations, and this is where we'll be finishing our review of, well, actually, no, we're not. Well, anyway, let's go into the conclusion. So in conclusion, despite the usual limitations of observational data, meaning what we discussed before, which is obviously there's problems with all studies, there's problems with recall, and so in conclusion, despite the usual limitations of observational data, and also causality impossible to determine, our study highlights an unfavorable association of LCD with overall and cause-specific mortality based on both individual data, meaning that first group, and the pooling of previous cohort studies, that second group of studies we discussed. Given the fact that long-term lower carbohydrate diets may well be associated with greater long-term harm, it might be important, keep in mind all the hedging here, may be associated, might be important to consider whether we should routinely recommend such diet in clinical practice for weight loss until further higher quality studies evaluate this issue in greater detail. Rather, our dietary patterns that have been associated with both short-term weight loss and long-term benefits, such as low-fat diets with plentiful fiber, may be preferable. And then they draw that conclusion at the end. So there's a lot to say about the final conclusion here, but in keeping with what we're trying to do here, which is to keep to what the authors are trying to say, we'll just say here that they're essentially saying that they're hedging a lot, of course, because we don't have clear science. They're also using words like may well and might be because nutritional studies are very difficult, as they mentioned at the beginning, that it would be very difficult to do a randomized study here, and that higher quality studies need to be done. But they do make the suggestion that maybe we should be routinely recommending other types of diets other than lower carbohydrate diets until we have further quality studies. As we mentioned, they don't make a whole lot of comment about high fat. And it's also, again, to remind you that this is based on population-wide data. And if there's anything about what this particular channel is about, it's about you becoming your own authority in health and understanding these things from a personal perspective. And we'll be getting into what that means in other videos, but suffice it to say, it means figuring out and understanding your own metabolic system so that you can make your own decisions. Obviously, there's something that everyone has in common, which is you need to be eating more vegetables. But even with that, you need to figure out what the best vegetables are for you. And we'll talk about that further in other studies. But I hope that this was interesting for you and that you understand a little bit more about how to look at these studies and to look at the language that the authors use to determine what they're looking for, what they're maybe not saying. Read between the lines. In this case, that was the high fat issue that we discussed. And, honestly, what's amazing, I recommend that you get a copy of this article. If you want a copy of this article, I'll leave a copy of it on my website. I'll provide a link in the description below and get you a copy of the mind map as well. If you want a copy of this mind map as well as the article, what is great about the article in all of these articles is the introduction is often a very valuable review of the overall scientific data with references so that you can go in and pull the actual studies that they mention as support for what they're talking about. And also in the discussion, oftentimes you'll see them quote a study to bolster a conclusion that they make. And in some cases, you'll pull that study and you'll find that that conclusion may not be the conclusion that you might draw from that particular study. So there are ways for authors to, they all come in with preconceived notions, obviously. So that's why there's no you really have to start reading these studies. So again, I'll leave a link below for you to be able to get a copy of the article so that you can look at the references. Any great study is also defined by the references it uses. That's why when I pick up a book, a nutritional book, the first thing I do is I look at the references, and I've read enough of the articles to be able to look and see what they're using as proof. That's one of the marks of a very, very good book in really anything. The same thing goes when you're looking at medical studies. You look at the references to see what are they using, which references are they using, because that really is the meat of the study. If they're building on previous results of good studies. So I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly enjoyed it. I love talking about these things. I hope you got value from this. If you like this format, or you have a suggestion for an article that made the news that you see is being used by various and sundry people to further certain agendas, definitely let me know. I hope this came across relatively bias-free, but even me, I come across with biases. We all have our biases. And I hope it came across as a somewhat fair rendering of the article that I presented. Please leave your comments below, and thank you so much for your attention. I love making these videos, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video. This is Dr. Carb signing out for the channel that is about you becoming your own authority in health. Talk to you soon.